So my name's Carrie Lee. I oversee the Career Planning Development Center here at Webster University. So today we're going to talk about tailoring your resume. If you have questions at any point, you're very welcome to just put those in the chat. Raise your hand. Otherwise, we'll have questions at the end and time for that as well. So it is really important that you customize and tailor your resume as you're applying to different types of opportunities. So first off, it shows the employer that you actually read the job description. You made sure to align with that because sometimes you get applicants and you look at their information and it just doesn't always make sense. Maybe they've made a career shift, maybe they were interested, even if they're a little underqualified or something, but if it doesn't feel like it is aligned or there's kind of a reason for why they're interested in the position, you may be ranked a little bit lower in that candidate pool. It is a really good way to make sure that all of your most relevant accomplishments, experiences, that those are all up at the top and ready for them to see. Because most recruiters and hiring managers will make kind of judgments about your application within a couple of seconds. So, they're not going to read through in detail unless they're seeing something that engages them. So if they're seeing that you have a relevant degree, relevant skills, experiences, and then they actually go through and read more, because if they're not seeing that, they will just move on to the next candidate. So you want to make sure that it's really easy for them to understand why you're a good fit. And obviously, you are limited in space. With your resume, one page is very standard for students or newer professionals. You can have a two-page resume if you have more experience, and so you're actually using that space and not just, using a tiny chunk. So that is just something that is a good way to make sure you're covering all the key information. So when you're actually targeting your resume for a particular opportunity, think about what are you looking at? So for instance, maybe if you're a computer science major, maybe you're applying to some kind of IT related jobs, and maybe you're also applying to some more software development, programmer focused positions. So you might have different resumes for each of those. So you may or may not kind of tailor your resume for each application. Sometimes it may make sense just to kind of tailor it for the types of roles, if that makes sense. So if you're applying to very similar things, you're probably going to have to do less customization than if you were applying to different types of opportunities and experiences. So you also want to consider the type of organization that you're planning to work for. If you're applying at a nonprofit, they maybe care more about, do you have a connection with the mission of that nonprofit? Have you engaged in volunteering, things that kind of show your interest in that, versus if you're applying to a job at a big multinational company, it doesn't mean that you can't talk about volunteer experience, because some of that volunteer experience might be related. But if it's not related, then maybe that might be less useful to include than some other things. And, you also just want to think about, what type of information, what type of format is going to be most appropriate for your audience. So, if you're applying to a PhD program and you're writing a CV, then you don't really have the same space limitations as you do if you're applying to a full-time job as a new graduate and it's that 1 or 2 page limit. And as you're looking at opportunities, especially if there's ones that you're really interested in, you really think this would be a good fit, make sure to do a little bit of research on the employer. So you want to look at and see, what are their mission and values as a company? What is kind of their main audience? Do they do IT consulting for other companies? Is this like a certain demographic of people that they serve or customers? What do they kind of do as an organization? Does it seem like there are things they really care about? Sometimes you can get a sense of, oh, they're really focused on sustainability. That's something that they've made an effort for. They've been recognized for, how environmentally efficient their organization is, like things like that. Sometimes you can kind of get a sense of what they might care about. So that might be helpful to address in some way. When you're looking at a particular job description, you know, go through the responsibilities. So when you're looking at things to say, are there any required qualifications versus preferred? So those required are things that you want to make sure are very obvious. Um, so if they're saying we require a certain degree, we, require that you know how to program in Python or you know how to use Adobe, things like that. And then preferred, obviously, you don't necessarily have to have all of those qualifications to be applied or to be considered. They're kind of just the nice to have. But if you do have those skills, you want to make sure that those are incorporated. So every time you're kind of seeing a pattern, so for instance, if they keep talking about, oh, do you have a question? Uh, okay. Yeah, if you have questions at any point, feel free to let me know or you can put in the chat. Um, so just kind of know any patterns. So, if they keep talking about data and they want you to have good critical thinking skills and analysis and, assessment, right, then you know that those are things that you want to address. Or if they keep talking about how important it is that you're working in a team and collaborative, kind of see what you can pick up, what is mentioned multiple times because the more that you can really address that an employer can see, yes, they have some related skills, they have related experiences, things like that, it's just going to make you a much stronger candidate. Oops. So we'll talk about each of these in detail, but these are really the main things that you want to customize when we talk about tailoring your resume. So the first one will be if you choose to have a summary of qualifications, objective, profile, this is always optional. So if you include one, it would just be one of those. And then like your section headers on your resume, how you're titling those, the order of the sections that you are including, the types of experiences that you're including, how you're talking about those experiences in your bullet points, and then those skill sections. So we'll kind of go through each of these pieces. So if you choose to have an objective is usually kind of 1 to 3 lines, just very focused, saying, seeking an opportunity to teach global fluency and Spanish language skills to elementary students, right? So it's just very to the point. And so you want to think about what your education is, what your goals are, kind of your most relevant skills. So if you're looking to apply your analysis skills or, your particular degree program. And then you also want to kind of think about the situation. So maybe you're really focused on front end development versus back end development, or you're interested in working with a particular demographic. So you're interested in counseling, children versus adults. Um, if there's a particular position title, a particular kind of career area, or functional area. So if you're looking for a finance job, but maybe more specifically, you're looking for jobs more in, investment banking or wealth management or treasury or things like that. So those are just the types of things that you can kind of keep in that objective, but typically like 1 or 2 kind of statements. For your summary statement or profile, if you choose to have that, this I would suggest is really a better idea if you have more experience. So if you are somebody that you have, maybe had a little bit of experience and now you're doing a new degree program and you're doing a career change, this is something that could be really helpful for you. Or if like you have 10 years of experience, then you obviously have more to summarize, right? So it can be more helpful in that sense. If you have a year or two of experience, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's not necessarily something you have to include because there's not going to be as much extensive things listed on your resume. So if you're including a summary statement or profile, I would kind of shoot for like 3 to 5 statements. So, really it should not be much longer than kind of a brief paragraph. A summary should not be half of a page because then it's not really a summary for a 1 or 2 page resume. And so in those kind of bulleted statements, it can be more paragraph format or kind of a bulleted format. Either way is okay for your summary. You want to think about what sets you apart. So, maybe you have some certain certifications that, especially if they're well known, they're mentioned as a requirement, a preference in the job posting. So, if you're looking for HR jobs, maybe they want you to have the SHRM certification. That's great to mention. If there are kind of experiences, so whether it's been in one industry or type of role, so if you have 10 years in the banking industry, right, that might be useful for mention. Or if you have, 5 years of programming experience, that can be helpful just to summarize right up front. You can also think about if you have any particular accomplishments or strengths that you want to incorporate. So, if you're really great at data visualizations, and that's something that you want to, mention. If you have any things that are really particularly valued in your industry. So, if you just had maybe some more unique experiences, accomplishments, those are all good things to highlight. So again, if you're going to include an objective summary statement or a profile, they should be very specific. And this is something that should always make sense because if you're talking about, all of your finance skills and experience, and then you're applying to a marketing job, it might make sense for you to apply to a marketing job if you have an MBA, and either would be fine, but it doesn't really help the recruiter if you're applying for a marketing job and then they say, well, why are you talking about all your finance experience, right? So you want to make sure that it makes sense. In terms of your format for your resume, something that you can always tailor are your headers. So for some headers, like your education, where you list your degree information, that's pretty much is what it is, right? For other sections with your experiences, you can create whatever headers make the most sense to you. So for instance, maybe you've had several different jobs. So you could have everything in one work experience section. You could break them up into different categories. So maybe you have like accounting experience in one section and then customer service experience in another section. If you worked at like a retail store or you worked at Starbucks or something, right? So then that would be a way for you to separate what are those more related experiences. You could do something like relevant experience and additional experience. You could group different types of experiences together. So maybe you've had, a lot of involvement on campus, but not necessarily paid positions. So you could just have a section that says involvement or leadership experience, and then talk about how you've been, treasurer of this organization and vice president of another organization, right? So know that you can change up those headers because that can help, especially on that first impression when somebody is looking at your resume. You also want to make sure that you are always thinking about the order of the sections. So as a current student or new graduate, if you are applying to internships or full-time positions, related to your degree, you want to have your education section first. So after your contact information, if you have a profile or summary or something that kind of frames the rest of your resume, then it should be your education because that is going to be your most relevant qualification. You want them to see that you're here, you're either working on your degree or finished it. And then after that, it is up to you. So if it is more relevant for you to talk about your data analytics projects than it is for you to talk about your Starbucks barista job, right, then have your project section listed next. If you want to have your skills section, if you want to have involvement, certifications, it is just whatever is going to be most relevant to that job description. As you keep gaining more experience as a professional, then you can kind of change it up. So like it's very common that you do move your education section down eventually. If you graduated from with your degree 10 years ago, then yes, you would include your work experience first because that is the most relevant, recent thing you're doing, and you could have your education system lower. So yeah, so that's just always something to think about. If you have a two-page resume, it is also really important that the first page has all of the key things, because in case they don't get to that second page, you want that to be the least relevant things. So, maybe you have been involved in some student clubs or done some volunteering or had, some work experience that wasn't as related. So that might still be very useful to include on your resume, but if you have more relevant qualifications, then just make sure those are on that first page. So in terms of types of experiences, there's a lot of flexibility with what you can choose to have. So if you've had full-time or part-time jobs before, internships, if you've worked on campus, if you've been involved in any type of like student activities, so if you're a member of the computer science club or, the residence hall council or whatever that might be, those are great to list. If you've done volunteering, if you've done freelance work, so maybe you're a marketing professional and so you've done kind of some just one-off projects for some small businesses or things like that, you could categorize that as well if you want to. If you're on any kind of consistent sports team. So like if you're on the golf team at Webster, you could list that if you want to. If it's like a consistent thing that you do, maybe you're part of a intramural club locally, that's fine. If it's just more interest, like I like playing soccer with my friends, I like, cooking, you don't need to include that. But if it's more of kind of a structure type of experience, that's totally fine. You can list projects. So these could be things that you did for your classes. If you had to do some type of thesis or capstone for a degree, that could be relevant to talk about. If you have done research, so maybe if you worked with a professor, you presented at a conference, things like that, those would also be relevant experiences to include. So then when you're talking about those experiences on your resume, you always want to make sure that you're adding in some bullet points to talk about, what did you do? How did you do it? Why does it matter? So for any of your statements, you want to start off with a strong action verb. So you don't need to use pronouns like I, me, my on your resume because it's your resume, so they know it's you. So you don't need to say I did this. You can just say, tutored high school students in algebra, geometry, and calculus, right? And so for those action verbs, you want to kind of avoid those really generic words like helped, used, worked. They're not bad words, but they're just a lot less specific than things like managed or tutored or designed or created, right? So that kind of helps people get a better immediate reading on kind of what you were doing. There's no real rule about how many bullet points you have to have for any experience listed. So what I would think about is, how relevant is that experience? And, what have you shown that is different about that experience than others? So if you've had like one internship that's really closely aligned with what you're applying for, you might have 5 bullet points. If you had a summer volunteer opportunity that you did for a month, maybe you have 1 point about that, right? So that's okay. What I would say is you just want to avoid having things where it's like, you have 10 different bullet points for one job and you're taking up, half a page or something. If you had that job for 10 years, sure, that maybe makes a little bit more sense. But if you were like, oh, I did this 2-month internship and I have 12 points, that's probably a little too much. So, kind of condense a little bit, think about what is most important, what took up the most time in that role. So you can also kind of think about, what do you want to focus on? So in any particular job, maybe there were kind of 5 main responsibilities that you did. So in terms of that, think about what is related in terms of skill set. So if there's things where, maybe you're an ITM student, and so you're looking at IT roles and you don't necessarily have IT specific experience, but in a part-time job, you had to do a lot of documentation. You had to write a lot of information up and policies and processes. So even if that doesn't have anything to do with IT, that is a relevant skill, right? That's something that you need to be good at in IT management to make sure that you have processes documented, you can communicate with your users well. So, if that might be a bullet point that you kind of move up or kind of spend a little bit more time focusing on. Because within those couple of bullet points that you have listed, if there is something that is kind of more context dependent, like kind of gives a better sense of your job, that could obviously be first, but otherwise, you want that to be sort of the most related to least related. So, for instance, if you worked at a retail store and so you weren't a manager, but maybe you helped train new employees on a certain process. That's something that you could emphasize and include as that first point if you're applying to HR jobs because you've shown that you are able to train people. If there are any kind of relevant industry keywords, those are also good things to include. So if, the job description is mentioning kind of certain competency areas, software programs, things like that, incorporate those as much as possible because for some applicant tracking systems, they will kind of tie in those skills and things. So it's nice if you have those listed. So, if you're applying to a job as a shift leader, for instance, if you're looking at the job responsibilities and you're seeing, okay, what are the most important things? Kind of what are the relevant skills? So, you have to manage inventory. You need to have customer service skills to work with customers. You need to help train new employees and supervise the other employees on shift. So those are kind of the main things that you'll be looking at. So, for a particular job, you might be talking about kind of the same things, but you might reorder, right? So if you have this experience as a shift leader and you're applying to a job in HR, right? Talk about training employees at the top. So they're seeing that right away. If you're applying to a job as a front desk, kind of support person, then probably they're going to think about what is that customer service. That's probably going to be the majority of what you're doing. So it's nice that, you have experience training people, but that's not necessarily the most important thing they're looking at for, right? You can also kind of rephrase your statement. So depending if there's certain keywords you want to include, like if they keep mentioning your organizational skills, you can use organized as a verb. Or again, maybe you kind of take in or remove certain things. So again, if you're applying to more like HR jobs, you could talk about, coaching employees on shift. So if you were the next person in charge, if the manager was gone, it might be useful for you to kind of call that out. So hopefully that makes sense just as a way that you might have the same experience, but you might kind of reorder or rewrite your bullet points a little bit for different types of jobs. So with the skill section, if you choose to have one on your resume, You want to make sure that it's really more about your tangible or technical skills. So these would be things like your languages that you're fluent in, software programs, kind of particular areas of competencies. So, if you're a data analytics student, what types of analysis have you done, right? What programs have you used? So, like Power BI or Tableau or things like that. The more transferable general skills, so things like leadership, communication, teamwork, those are good skills that employers want, but it is a lot more helpful to incorporate those into your experience descriptions. So like if worked at a front desk job on campus somewhere or retail or those types of customer service experience, then talk about your customer service experience in that description instead of just writing the words customer service in a skill section. And so, as I mentioned earlier, for most larger companies, they will use those applicant tracking systems. So, things like Workday or ADP or Greenhouse, things like that. So, it depends on the system. There's different capabilities, different companies use it differently. For some of them, they may include keywords. So those are often those skills. So if they say we want this data analyst to have experience with Power BI and Tableau and Excel, you want to make sure those words are on your resume if you have any experience at all with those systems. Within your skills section, you want to have the kind of most relevant and most impressive things first. So pretty much everyone in this day and age should know how to use Microsoft Word, right? That is a standard thing to know. Don't list Microsoft Word as your first skill if you are applying to a job in IT management, right? Because they're going to say, right, you should know that. Do you know things like different ticketing softwares? Do you know programming languages? Do you know different operating systems? That is more useful, impressive for them to know, right? So kind of think about how you're ordering those. If you have a lot of skills, then it might be helpful to include subheaders. You don't have to, but maybe you're somebody that you speak multiple languages. So maybe you have a separate subheader that's, your language skills, and then you have another subheader for your more technical skills or your data analytics skills, things like that. So it's always kind of up to you what you feel like is going to be most useful, because if you have like 10 skills that are all kind of random, that might be less helpful for folks. And just to say, you do want to make sure those key requirements, skills, things are listed on your resume somewhere, but you also want to be intentional about it. Because sometimes when I am looking at resumes for people, if you have like 40 skills listed and it's just this whole wall of text at the end of your resume, that is not really helpful for people, right? Because if they're just going to get overwhelmed and not really read it, then that's not super useful for them. So, it doesn't mean you have to include every single skill you are capable of, because if you do a bunch of video editing in your free time, but you're applying to a data analytics job, you probably don't need to include all those video editing softwares versus if you're applying to a job that focuses on that, of course, you would want to center those. So these are just some example resumes. We have others on our connections page. Your resume doesn't have to look exactly like either of these. These are just examples of different formats and layouts. But as you can see, Vivian is our fake student looking for accounting experiences. So, all of her accounting experience is up here at the top. So she has her degree, she has her accounting internships listed first, and her skills, and then those less relevant, kind of more customer service, her on-campus jobs are lower down, right? So that's always an option to kind of break up your experiences. On the right, Hazel, graduated several years ago and has been working. So, it's probably more relevant for her at this point to talk about her work experience than it is to say, here's my degree that I got from Webster 5 years ago. So, like I mentioned, depending on, where you at as you continue to move through your career, you can always kind of change up your sections, change up your order, kind of what you decide to give space to. So I just wanted to mention really briefly about cover letters. Not every single, job application will require a cover letter or ask for one. If they do, this is another opportunity because if you are kind of starting out, you don't have a lot of experience, for your resume, you might not have tons to adjust. If you've done a couple of things, that might be all you have. So you can tailor it as much as you can with your skills or things. But your cover letter, this is really where you're connecting the dots between your skills and experiences to that job description. So sometimes there might be things that you don't really have a space for in your resume. Like if you've decided to shift careers in some way, that's sometimes harder to kind of explain on a resume versus in a cover letter. You can say, oh, I was working in finance. I started doing a lot of, reporting and analysis, and I learned that I just really love digging into the data. And so I decided to do my degree in data analytics and focus on that because I realized this was a really good fit for my skill set, right? That's much easier to include on a cover letter. You can also make sure and address why are you interested in that particular job and at that particular organization. So, especially if you're applying to jobs in like education, nonprofit sectors, they really care about that. They want to know, why do you want to work at this organization? Why do you care about this? If you're applying to, a software job at a big company, they probably care a little bit less. Again, depending on the role, the hiring manager, they may or may not ask for a cover letter. So this is also kind of a place too where you can just go into more depth. So if you have some things listed on your resume, you could just talk in more detail about those experiences or accomplishments you have. There might be things that you've just kind of self-learned, so it doesn't make sense to maybe include as projects or on your resume, but you could talk about that more in your cover letter if you want to. But overall, hopefully this kind of gave you some ideas for how you can tailor your resume, how you can adjust that. So we have a lot of information on our connections page about, here's different resume samples, cover letter samples. If you have any questions or you'd like me to kind of talk about anything in more detail at this point, please feel free to put those questions in the chat or you can just unmute.